August, 480 BCE. A Greek shepherd named Ephialtes stands before the great king of Persia with a secret that will change history. For 2 days, Xerxes, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, had watched his army funnel into a narrow coastal pass called Thermopylae. And for 2 days, he'd watched them die. Herodotus tells us that the King of Kings leapt from his throne 3 times in terror as wave after wave of Persian soldiers broke against a wall of Greek bronze. Somewhere in that pass, a Spartan king named Leonidas was turning an empire's confidence to ash. Now Ephialtes was offering the way around. But what Xerxes didn't realize, what he couldn't realize, was that even his victory would become a wound that would bleed Persian morale all the way to the sea at Salamis. This is the story of how 300 Spartans didn't just hold a pass, they broke something inside an empire. Picture this. You're standing on a cliff overlooking the Malian Gulf. Below you, snaking. Along the coastline is a strip of land so narrow that in some places, a single wagon could barely pass through. Mountains on one side, sea on the other. And in between? A killing ground. This is Thermopylae, the hot gates, named for the sulfurous springs that bubble up from the earth like the land itself is bleeding heat. And in August of 480 BCE, this sliver of rock became the most important piece of real estate on the planet. Why? Because somewhere to the north, the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled was marching south. And they were hungry for Greek blood. Let's talk numbers. Because the numbers are where this story gets impossible. Modern historians estimate Xerxes brought between 120,000 and 300,000 men. Let that sink in. Even at the conservative estimate, we're talking about a force so massive that ancient sources claimed it drank rivers dry. They said the Persian army was so vast that when they shot their arrows, they blotted out the sun. You've probably heard that line before. It's famous. But here's what you might not know. When a Spartan warrior named Dinakes heard this threat, he didn't flinch, he didn't pray, he laughed. "Good," he said. "Then we'll fight in the shade." That's not bravado. That's something else entirely. That's a man who has already made peace with death, a man who knows exactly what he's walking into, and walks anyway. But here's the thing nobody tells you about Thermopylae. It wasn't just 300 Spartans. The real Greek force numbered around 7,000 men. Spartans, yes, but also Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, warriors from across Greece who looked at that narrow pass and saw the same thing Leonidas saw. A chance. Not a chance to win. Let's be clear about that. Nobody standing at Thermopylae thought they were going to defeat the Persian Empire. That wasn't the plan. The plan was simpler and far more terrifying. Hold the line. Buy time. Make the Persians pay for every single inch of Greek soil in blood. And here's where geography becomes destiny. See, Xerxes had the greatest army ever assembled. He had cavalry that could sweep across open plains like a storm. He had archers that could darken the sky. He had numbers that should have crushed any opposition through sheer mathematical certainty. But none of that mattered at Thermopylae. The pass was so narrow that Xerxes couldn't use his cavalry. His archers couldn't find angles. His overwhelming numbers became meaningless because he could only send so many men into the gap at once. It was like trying to flood a house through a keyhole. And waiting on the other side of that keyhole? The most disciplined killing machines the ancient world had ever produced. The Spartans. Now, let's talk about what made these men different. Because this isn't Hollywood. This isn't exaggeration. The Spartans were something the world had never seen before. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and thrown into a system called the agoge. It wasn't training. It was transformation. They were starved to teach them to steal food without getting caught. They were beaten to teach them to endure pain without crying out. They slept on hard reeds. They wore single cloaks through winter. By the time a Spartan man picked up his shield and spear, he had been forged in suffering for over 2 decades. But here's the part that matters most. Spartans didn't fight as individuals. They fought as a unit, a phalanx. Each man's shield protected the man to his left. Each man's spear struck in coordination with his brother's. They moved like a single organism, a wall of bronze and muscle and absolute, unwavering discipline. And leading them at Thermopylae was Leonidas, a king, a warrior, and a man who had received a prophecy. The oracle at Delphi had spoken. Either Sparta would fall or a Spartan king would die. Leonidas knew. He knew when he marched north that he wasn't coming home. He handpicked his 300 knowing that he was selecting men for a suicide mission. Every single one of them had a living son. Do you understand what that means? He chose men whose bloodlines would continue, men whose deaths wouldn't end their families. He was building an army of the already dead. Xerxes arrived at Thermopylae in late August, and he did something that reveals everything about what he expected. He waited. 4 days. The great king of Persia, commander of the largest military force in human history, sat outside a narrow pass defended by a handful of Greeks, and waited. Why? Because he expected them to run. Think about it from Xerxes' perspective. He had conquered nations. He had built bridges across the Hellespont so massive that his army took 7 days and 7 nights to cross. He had whipped the sea itself when a storm destroyed his first bridge, literally ordered his men to lash the water as punishment. This was a man who believed he could command nature, and now he was supposed to believe that a few thousand Greeks would stand against him. Impossible. They would see his army stretching to the horizon. They would count his ships choking the coastline. They would do the math, and they would flee. But 4 days passed, and the Greeks didn't move. So Xerxes sent a messenger, a scout who would ride to the Greek lines and report back what he saw. What he saw defied explanation. The Spartans were exercising, combing their long hair, stretching, preparing their bodies as calmly as if this were any other day. Some were oiling themselves. Others were practicing formations. They weren't preparing to flee. They were preparing to fight. The scout rode back. Xerxes listened. And according to Herodotus, he laughed. He actually laughed. But there was a man in his camp who wasn't laughing. A Greek exile named Demaratus, a former Spartan king who had fled to Persia. Xerxes called him forward. "What does this mean?" the great king asked. "Are these men mad?" Demaratus shook his head. "O king, you asked me once about these men. I told you the truth then, though you didn't believe me. These are Spartans. They are preparing for battle. It is their custom to dress their hair when they are about to risk their lives." He paused. "If you defeat these men, there is no other nation on earth that will stand against you. You are now facing the noblest kingdom in Greece and the bravest men." Xerxes still didn't believe him. How could he? The math was impossible. So on the 5th day, he sent his first wave into the pass. And the slaughter began. The Medes went first, fierce warriors from the heart of the empire. Thousands of them poured into the narrow gap, eager for glory, certain of victory. They died. The pass was so narrow that the Persians couldn't bring their numbers to bear. They came in waves, and each wave crashed against the Greek phalanx like water against stone. The Spartans fought in rotation, one unit holding the line while others rested, then switching with mechanical precision. The Persians had never seen anything like it. Their wicker shields splintered against Greek bronze. Their shorter spears couldn't reach past the wall of overlapping Spartan shields. And when they got close enough to fight, They found themselves facing men who had trained for this moment their entire lives, men who didn't panic, men who didn't break, men who killed with the efficiency of craftsmen. Hours passed, bodies piled up, and somewhere behind the Persian lines, Xerxes watched from his golden throne. And then, it happened. Herodotus recorded the moment, and it's one of the most haunting images in ancient history. The King of Kings, ruler of Persia, Babylon, Egypt, and a dozen other conquered lands, leapt from his throne, not once, not twice, 3 times, in terror. This was a man who commanded millions, a man whose word was law across half the known world. And now he was watching his army die. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers entered that narrow pass. Wave after wave didn't come out. The Medes fell, then the Scythians. The ground grew slick with blood. Bodies stacked so high that the Greeks had to pause just to clear the dead. And still the line held. As the sun climbed higher, Xerxes made a decision. If regular troops couldn't break these Greeks, he would send his finest, the Immortals, 10,000 elite warriors, called immortals because their number never dropped below 10,000. Whenever one fell, another took his place. The pride of Persia. Men who had never known defeat. They marched into the pass. They died. The Spartans had a trick. They would pretend to retreat, falling back in apparent panic. The Persians would surge forward, sensing victory, and then the Spartans would turn, in perfect unison, shields locking, spears leveling. It was a trap, and the Persians fell for it again and again. By nightfall, thousands of Persian soldiers lay dead. Greek losses? Minimal. Day 2 brought more of the same. Different units, different tactics, nothing worked, and whispers spread through the Persian camp. What were these men? Were they human? That's when Ephialtes arrived. History remembers few traitors by name, but it remembers this one. A Greek shepherd who knew something that could change everything. There was another path, a narrow mountain trail called the Thermopylae path, winding through the hills above Thermopylae. If an army could navigate it at night, they could surround the defenders. Why did Ephialtes do it? Greed. He expected a reward. Xerxes didn't hesitate. He ordered his commander Hydarnes to take the immortals and march through the night. The trap was being set. But the Greeks knew about the path. Leonidas had stationed 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the mountain to guard it. So what went wrong? The Phocians failed. When the immortals came through the darkness, the Phocians retreated to higher ground instead of holding at all costs. They weren't Spartans. By dawn, messengers raced down the mountain. The Greeks at Thermopylae were surrounded. The impossible defense was about to become an impossible escape. But escape was still possible. There was still time to retreat. If they left now. Picture that sunrise. 7,000 exhausted Greeks receiving word that their position is compromised. Behind them, the path to safety. Ahead, the Persian army massing, and descending from the mountains, an enemy force moving to cut off retreat. Leonidas calls a council, then makes a decision that will echo through millennia. Most of the army will leave. The allies are dismissed, but the Spartans will stay. All 300. Someone needed to hold the pass long enough for the others to escape. Someone needed to buy time with blood. "Breakfast well," Leonidas told his men. "For tonight we dine in Hades." But the Spartans weren't alone. Here's what the movies get wrong. The Thespians stayed. 700 warriors from the small city of Thespiae refused to leave. Not bound by Spartan law. Free to walk away with honor intact. They stayed anyway. Why? Because Thespiae lay directly in the Persian path. They weren't staying for glory. They were staying for love. Love of home. Love of family. Love of a future they would never see. History remembers the 300 Spartans. The 700 Thespians deserve their place too. On the morning of the third day, roughly 1,000 Greeks looked at impossible odds and didn't blink. The defense was over. The last stand was about to begin. The third day dawned blood-red over Thermopylae. 1,000 Greeks, against an empire. No retreat, no reinforcements, no hope of survival, just a single burning question. How many Persians can we take with us? What happened next defied every rule of warfare, every instinct of self-preservation, every logical calculation a soldier could make. The Greeks advanced. Not into the narrow pass where they had fought for 2 days, not into the choke point that had neutralized Persian numbers. They marched forward into the wider ground, toward the enemy, into the open, where the Persians could finally bring their numbers to bear. Why? Why abandon the tactical advantage that had kept them alive? Because this wasn't about survival anymore. This was about maximum damage. This was about killing as many Persians as possible before the end. This was about making Xerxes pay such a price that his victory would taste like ash. The narrow pass had been perfect for defense. But for pure, unrestrained slaughter? The wider ground gave the Greeks room to swing, room to charge, room to turn their final moments into a nightmare the Persian army would never forget. Leonidas understood something profound. A defensive last stand could be dismissed. Brave men dying behind their shields, overwhelmed by numbers, that's tragedy, but it's expected. But men who charge, men who attack when surrounded, men who choose aggression over protection in their final moments, that's something else entirely. That's the stuff of nightmares. That's the story that spreads through an army like plague. The Persians hesitated. Think about that. The greatest military force ever assembled, facing 1,000 exhausted men, and they hesitated. For 2 days, they had fed soldiers into that pass like wood into a furnace. They had watched their comrades come back broken, or not come back at all. They had heard the sounds of battle and seen the bodies pile up. And now these same Greeks, these demons in bronze, were walking toward them, not retreating into a final defensive position, not making peace with death behind their shields, attacking. Xerxes had to drive them forward. Ancient sources tell us he used whips. His officers literally beat their own men toward the Greek line because the soldiers' legs had forgotten how to advance. When your army needs to be whipped into fighting 1,000 men, you've already lost something that numbers can't measure. The collision was apocalyptic. Greek spears shattered against Persian shields. When the spears broke, the Greeks drew swords. When swords dulled on bone, they used daggers. When daggers were lost, they used hands, teeth, anything. The Spartans fought like men possessed. Because what do you threaten a man who has already accepted death? What leverage do you have over someone who kissed his children goodbye knowing he would never see them again? None. You have nothing. And that makes them the most dangerous thing on any battlefield. Leonidas was everywhere. The Spartan king, 60 years old, according to some sources, fought in the front ranks like a man half his age. His crimson cloak became a beacon. His voice rallied the line again and again. And then he fell. A Persian spear found its mark. Or maybe an arrow. The sources aren't clear on exactly how it happened. What they are clear on is what came next. The fight over his body became the most savage combat of the entire battle. In Greek culture, there was nothing more shameful than allowing an enemy to claim your fallen leader's body. So Persians knew this. They surged forward, desperate to drag Leonidas away, to display his corpse, to break Greek morale once and for all. The Spartans knew it too. 4 times, the Persians pushed forward to claim the body. 4 times, the Greeks drove them back. The ground around Leonidas became a slaughterhouse. Men died standing up because there was no room to fall. And in that chaos, something remarkable happened. Persian royal blood spilled onto Greek soil. Abracomes and Hyperanthes, two of Xerxes' own brothers, princes of the Achaemenid dynasty. They had joined the assault, perhaps seeking glory, perhaps trying to inspire their faltering troops. They found death instead. Let that sink in. Xerxes wasn't just losing soldiers. He was losing family. The great king who had marched into Greece expecting easy conquest was watching his own bloodline cut down by men who should have been crushed days ago. The Thespians died beside the Spartans. 700 men from a small city, fighting, with the same fury, the same refusal to break. History has been unfair to them. The movies don't mention them. The legends focus on Sparta. But in those final hours, Thespian blood mixed with Spartan blood in the same dust. They had no traditions of glorious death, no laws forbidding retreat. They were farmers and craftsmen who had picked up weapons to defend their homes, and they chose to die rather than abandon their allies. That's not martial culture. That's not training. That's something deeper, something that can't be taught, only chosen. As the sun climbed toward noon, the Greeks were pushed back. Step by bloody step, they retreated toward a small hill at the rear of the pass. The original position was lost. The wider ground was lost. Everything was lost except that tiny mound of earth. But they still wouldn't break. The final survivors, how many? 100? 50? The sources don't agree. Formed a circle on that hill. Shields locked outward, spears bristling like a dying porcupine. Xerxes made a decision. He was done. Done losing men to these madmen. Done watching his army's morale bleed out in a mountain pass. He ordered the archers forward. Imagine the silence that fell, the hand-to-hand combat stopping, the clash of bronze fading, and then the whisper of thousands of arrows being nocked, the creak of thousands of bows being drawn. The Spartans knew what was coming. They had been told days ago that Persian arrows would block out the sun. They had laughed then. Were they laughing now? I don't know. But I know they didn't run. They didn't beg. They didn't try to surrender. They raised their shields. They stood with their brothers. And they waited. The sky went dark. When the arrows stopped falling, nothing moved on that hill. Thermopylae was over. The Persians had won. But had they? Walk through that pass an hour after the battle ended. What do you see? Persian dead carpeting the ground. Estimates vary wildly. Ancient sources claimed 20,000, which is almost certainly exaggerated. Modern historians suggest something lower, but still staggering. 4,000? 6,000? 10,000? Whatever the number, this much is certain. The Persian army had been savaged. Elite units had been shattered. Royal princes lay dead. And the survivors had watched the greatest military machine in history struggle for 3 days against a force they should have swept aside in hours. What does that do to an army's psychology? What does that do to soldiers who have been told they're invincible? Xerxes walked through the pass after the battle. He found Leonidas's body, or what remained of it, and he made a decision that revealed everything about his state of mind. He ordered the head cut off and mounted on a stake. This was not Persian custom. Persians generally respected fallen enemies, especially brave ones. Mutilating a corpse was an act of dishonor, of rage, of something very close to fear. Xerxes wasn't celebrating a victory. He was exorcising a demon, the man who had defied him, the man who had made him leap from his throne in terror, the man who had killed his brothers and broken his immortals and turned a simple mountain pass into a graveyard. Even in death, Leonidas was under his skin. Xerxes won. Let's be absolutely clear about that. He took the pass. He killed every last defender. He marched his army south and eventually burned Athens itself to the ground. By every military measure, Thermopylae was a Persian victory. So why did he try so hard to hide what it cost? Ancient sources describe something extraordinary. After the battle, Xerxes ordered his men to dig mass graves, not for the Greeks, but for his own dead. He buried them in trenches, covered them with earth and leaves, hid the bodies from view. Then he invited his naval crews to come ashore and tour the battlefield. Think about that. The King of Kings staging a propaganda exhibition at a massacre site. He wanted his sailors, men who would soon face the Greek fleet, to see the pass, to see the Greek dead scattered across the ground, to see Persian victory with their own eyes, but not the cost. Never the cost. Herodotus tells us that Xerxes left only about 1,000 Persian bodies visible. 1,000, to match roughly the Greek dead, as if this had been an even fight, as if the greatest army in history hadn't been bleeding for 3 days against a handful of defenders. The naval crews walked through the pass. They saw the Greek corpses. They were supposed to feel confidence, inevitability, the certainty of Persian triumph. But here's the thing about lies. They work until they don't. Word spread anyway. It always does. The soldiers who had fought at Thermopylae knew the truth. They had been there. They had watched friends die in that narrow gap. They had felt the terror of facing men who wouldn't break. And soldiers talk. In whispers at first, then louder. Did you hear about the pass? Did you hear how many we lost? Did you hear what those Spartans did? The Persian army was a coalition. Dozens of nations, hundreds of tribes, men from Egypt and India and Ethiopia and Phoenicia, all marching under the Persian banner. Their loyalty wasn't to Xerxes personally. It was to the idea of Persian invincibility. And that idea had just been cracked. Not broken. Not yet. But cracked. A fracture running through the foundation of the empire's confidence. But what about the Greeks? While Xerxes was burying his dead and staging theatrical tours, something else was happening across the Greek world. News of Thermopylae spread like fire. At first it must have seemed like tragedy. The pass had fallen. The defenders were dead. Athens would have to be evacuated. The Persian army was coming. But the story that spread wasn't a story of defeat. It was something else entirely. 300 Spartans. A narrow pass. 3 days against the largest army ever assembled. Did you hear? They held for 3 days. Did you hear? The great king leapt from his throne in terror. Did you hear? They killed his brothers. They broke his immortals. Did you hear what Leonidas said? Come and take them. The Greeks hadn't won. Everyone knew that. But they had done something that felt like more than losing. They had proven that Persians could bleed, that the empire could be hurt, that courage and discipline could stand against overwhelming numbers. And if it could happen at Thermopylae, maybe it could happen again. This is the moment where history pivots, where a military defeat transforms into something far more powerful. The Greek city-states had been divided before Thermopylae, bickering, suspicious of each other, unable to unite against the common threat. But sacrifice changes things. Leonidas hadn't just bought time with his death. He had purchased something more valuable: unity, purpose, a rallying cry that transcended city walls and political rivalries. The Spartans died for Greece. The Thespians died for Greece. What are you willing to do? City after city answered. Men who had been reluctant to fight suddenly volunteered. Resources that had been hoarded were now shared. The fractured Greek alliance began to solidify into something harder, something more dangerous. The Persians had won the battle, but they had awakened something they couldn't kill with arrows. 3 weeks after Thermopylae, the Greek fleet gathered at Salamis. Salamis was a narrow strait near Athens, and the Greeks had learned something crucial from the hot gates. Straits, passes, choke points, places where Persian numbers meant nothing. The Greek commander Themistocles understood. He had watched what Leonidas accomplished in that mountain pass. He had seen how terrain could equalize an impossible fight. Now he would do the same thing at sea. Xerxes had a massive fleet, perhaps 1,000 ships. The Greeks had maybe 300. By every calculation, the Persian navy should have swept them aside. But Themistocles lured them into the narrow strait, where their numbers became a liability, where their ships couldn't maneuver, where discipline and skill mattered more than raw quantity. Sound familiar? The Battle of Salamis was a catastrophe for Persia. In a single day, Xerxes lost perhaps 200 ships, maybe more. His naval power, the force that was supposed to support his army, to supply his troops, to maintain control of the Aegean, was shattered. And once again, Xerxes watched from a throne on shore. Once again, he saw his invincible forces broken by Greeks who refused to accept the obvious mathematics of defeat. Once again, the King of Kings sat helpless while his empire bled. Here's what historians sometimes miss. The psychological damage from Thermopylae didn't end at Thermopylae. It echoed. At Salamis, the Persian sailors already knew that Greeks could stand against impossible odds. They had heard the stories. They had seen the hidden graves. They knew that their army had struggled for 3 days against 1,000 men. And now they were sailing into another narrow gap, another choke point, another place where Persian numbers wouldn't matter. The confidence that Xerxes had tried so hard to manufacture at Thermopylae, the staged battlefield tours, the hidden graves, the careful propaganda, none of it held. Because the truth had spread faster than his lies. The Greeks wouldn't break. The Greeks would fight. The Greeks would make you pay. That knowledge was a wound, and it bled into every engagement that followed. After Salamis, Xerxes made a decision that revealed everything. He went home. The great king of Persia, commander of the largest invasion force in history, turned around and marched back to Asia. He left a general named Mardonius behind with a portion of the army. But Xerxes himself was done. Why? The official explanation involves supply lines and politics and the need to manage his empire. And there's truth to that. But there's another truth too. Xerxes had been broken. Not his army, not his empire, him, personally. He had marched into Greece expecting glory, expecting submission, expecting the natural order of things. Big conquers small, many defeats few, empires crush city-states. Instead, he had watched that natural order shatter against Greek bronze. He had buried thousands of his men in hidden graves. He had lost brothers. He had seen his elite immortals broken by farmers and craftsmen. He had witnessed his navy destroyed in a strait that should have been a trap for the Greeks. At some point, victory stops feeling like victory. At some point, the cost becomes too heavy to carry. Xerxes reached that point. The next year, at a place called Plataea, the Greeks finished what Thermopylae started. Mardonius and his remaining Persian army were destroyed, utterly. The invasion was over. And when the Greeks built their monument at Thermopylae, they chose their words carefully. Go, stranger, and tell the Spartans that here we lie, obedient to their laws. Not boastful, not triumphant, just a simple statement of fact. We were ordered to hold this pass. We held it until we died, that's all. But that all contained everything. Duty, sacrifice, the willingness to die for something larger than yourself. 2,500 years. That's how long this story has survived. 25 centuries of retelling, reimagining, remembering. From Herodotus, scratching on papyrus, to Hollywood blockbusters, to you, right now, listening to these words. Why? Why does Thermopylae endure when so many other battles have been forgotten? Bigger battles. More decisive battles. Battles that actually changed the political map in ways that Thermopylae never did. The answer isn't military, it's human. Let's be honest about what Thermopylae wasn't. It wasn't a victory. The pass fell. Every defender died. The Persian army marched through and burned Athens to the ground. It wasn't strategically decisive. The real turning point was Salamis. That's where Persian power actually broke. Thermopylae just bought time, a few days at most. It wasn't even the biggest sacrifice. More Greeks died in other battles of the Persian wars. More soldiers have given their lives in countless conflicts throughout history. So what makes Thermopylae different? Choice. That's the word that separates this story from every other last stand in history. The defenders at Thermopylae chose to die, not because they were trapped, not because retreat was impossible, but because they decided that some things matter more than survival. Leonidas could have withdrawn. When news came that the Persians were marching through the mountain path, when it became clear that the position was compromised, he had options. The other Greek allies left. Nobody blamed them. It was the militarily sensible thing to do. But Leonidas looked at his 300 Spartans. He looked at the 700 Thespians who refused to leave. And he made a calculation that had nothing to do with military strategy. If we run, we survive. But something else dies. If we stay, we die. But something else survives. He chose the second option. What survives when brave men die? This is the question that echoes across millennia, and Thermopylae provides the answer. Stories survive. The story of Thermopylae didn't just inspire the Greeks at Salamis. It inspired them for generations. It became the foundational myth of Greek identity, the moment when a small, divided people stood against the greatest empire on earth and refused to kneel. That story spread beyond Greece. Romans told it. Medieval knights heard it. Enlightenment philosophers studied it. American revolutionaries invoked it. And here you are, still listening. Leonidas died in a mountain pass in 480 BCE. But the story he created? That's still alive, still inspiring, still asking the same question it asked 25 centuries ago. What would you die for? The Persians never understood this. They won the battle. They took the pass. They burned Athens. By every measure they used to calculate power, they should have felt triumphant. But you can't burn a story. You can't conquer an idea. You can't kill courage by killing the men who display it, because the display itself becomes immortal. Xerxes went home after Salamis. His empire remained the largest in the world. He continued to rule millions. By any objective standard, he was still one of the most powerful men who had ever lived. But something had changed. The myth of Persian invincibility died at Thermopylae. The certainty that large always defeats small, that empires always crush resistance, that numbers always prevail, that certainty bled out in a Greek mountain pass. And once that certainty is gone, it never comes back. Here's what the movies get wrong. They make Thermopylae about muscles and violence, about slow-motion combat and stylized death, about 300 warriors against 1 million enemies. That's not what makes the story powerful. What makes it powerful is the choice. The moment when Leonidas dismissed the allies and told them to save themselves. The moment when the Thespians said, no, we're staying too. The moment when 1,000 men looked at certain death and decided that dying well mattered more than living long. That's not about physical strength. That's about something else entirely. And here's what history often forgets. The Thespians, 700 men from a small city, not legendary warriors, not products of the brutal Spartan training system, just ordinary Greeks who picked up shields and spears and marched north to defend their homeland. They weren't bound by Spartan law. When Leonidas ordered the allies to withdraw, the Thespians could have left with honor. Nobody would have blamed them. Nobody would have called them cowards. They stayed anyway. Their city, Thespiae, was destroyed by the Persians shortly after the battle. The men who died at Thermopylae never knew if their sacrifice had made any difference. They died with no guarantee that their families would survive, that their city would be rebuilt, that their story would be remembered. They stayed anyway. That's not military discipline. That's love. Love of home. Love of brothers in arms. Love of something larger than individual survival. The Spartans get the glory. The Thespians deserve to share it. So what's the real lesson of Thermopylae? Not that courage always wins. It doesn't. Leonidas died. His men died. The Thespians died. Sometimes the brave lose. Not that sacrifice is always rewarded. The defenders of Thermopylae never saw the victory at Salamis. They never knew that Greece would survive. They died with failure as the last thing they witnessed. The real lesson is simpler and harder. Some things are worth dying for, not because death is glorious, not because sacrifice guarantees success, but because how you face the impossible reveals who you really are. Leonidas could have retreated. He chose to stay. The Thespians could have left. They chose to stay. And in that choice, in that willingness to give everything for something beyond themselves, they became immortal. Xerxes took the pass, but he left something behind in it. He left his confidence, his certainty, his belief that the world would always bend to Persian power. He left the bodies of his brothers, the shattered remnants of his immortals, the morale of an army that had been told victory was inevitable. He left the seed of his own defeat. Because Thermopylae didn't save Greece. Let's be clear about that. The pass fell. The defenders died. Athens burned. But Thermopylae ignited Greece. It turned a scattered collection of rival city-states into something unified, something motivated by more than politics or profit, something that believed, truly believed, that they could stand against the impossible. That belief carried them to victory at Salamis. At Plataea, it carried them through the Persian wars and into a golden age that would shape Western civilization forever. All because 1,000 men refused to run. There's a monument at Thermopylae today, a statue of Leonidas, spear raised, facing north toward the ancient Persian advance. Every year, tourists come. They stand where the pass once narrowed. They try to imagine what it felt like to hold that line. The geography has changed. The coastline has shifted. The narrow gap that made the defense possible is now a wide plain. Time erases everything eventually. Everything except stories. The story of Thermopylae survives because it speaks to something permanent in human nature. The need to believe that courage matters, that sacrifice has meaning, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they decide that some things are worth more than life. So here's the final truth. Sometimes the greatest victories look like defeats. Thermopylae was a massacre, a slaughter, a military failure by every objective standard, and it changed the world. Because sometimes winning costs more than losing ever could. Xerxes won the pass and lost his empire's soul. Leonidas lost his life and gained immortality. 25 centuries later, we remember the men who died. The king who killed them? He's a footnote to their story. Go, stranger, and tell the Spartans that here we lie, obedient to their laws. And tell the Thespians, too. They earned it.